Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out my Vengeance Demon Hunter class guide for Shadowlands patch 9.1. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. We're making an effort to respond to all of them, since I'm sure there will be plenty of specifics I can't possibly cover in a video that isn't like 4 hours long. And while I'm at it, like and subscribe. Alright, let's get to it. Let's quickly go over the list of class changes to Demon Hunters in patch 9.1. Alright, that was very fast. Now let's move on to Covenants. Kyrian is the #1 choice for Vengeance Demon Hunters in both Mythic Plus and Raids. Elysian Decree deals a massive amount of burst AoE damage. It also generates 3 soul fragments, so it has a decent chunk of self-healing value as well. Kyrian also has the best signature skill available to tanks, an extra health potion. Having access to another instant self-healing tool is a really good thing, and its value should never be underestimated. In terms of options, the Night Fae and Venthyr are just okay. If you play them because you prefer them for Havoc, they won't be terrible, but they are worse. Necrolord is also not horrendous, but it's unreliable, and that alone is enough to make it, I would say, the worst option. Ultimately, if you want to play Vengeance Demon Hunter at a high competitive level, or frankly, you just want an easy time getting into groups on one, you gotta be Kyrian. Moving on to Soulbinds. Kyrian has a great Soulbind in Pelagos. There's not a ton to say here, he's pretty basic, but he's extremely good. His new traits that unlock at the bottom of the tree as you gain renown in patch 9.1 are also good. Cleo was an interesting choice for pushing Mythic Plus in Season 1. She was defensive, but then offered like a lot of crit value, and I think she could still be useful in the next patch, but her new traits that are deeper in the tree kind of suck, so I think she just won't get used. Instead, I think Forge Light Prime Mechanicos is going to see more use in patch 9.1. His new traits can be a really interesting DPS increase over Pelagos, especially in AoE. I don't love him mechanically because he's not really useful defensively at all, and he has a small knockback that can be annoying in Mythic Plus. Still, you can potentially use him in raids to pump out more burst damage, especially in AoE thanks to his new end tier trait that grants a big burst of damage and cooldown reduction when you cast Elysian Decree in AoE. And I guess that would be good for pushing speed running through lower level Mythic Plus as well. Your choices on the way there are a relatively minor offensive passive or a relatively minor defensive passive. Pick your poison there based on how hard you're getting hit. Neither of the conduit options are going to make that much of a difference. And now let's quickly cover conduits, which fit into those empty sockets in the Soulbind trees. Growing Inferno is the better of the 2 generic conduits available to all Vengeance Demon Hunters. It's a pretty decent increase to Immolation Aura's damage, and it's generally the best potency conduit you have available. The Kyrian potency conduit is Repeat Decree, and it's very good. It's more damage from your hardest hitting skill. It doesn't spawn any more soul fragments, but that's okay. It's extra damage, and extra damage don't hurt. Well, it does, but that's good. The other potency conduits are kind of bad. Patch 9.1 has added Adaptive Armor Fragment to all tank specs, and it's fine. It was initially a gigantic agility stat proc. It was like 150 agility or something. Now it's been changed to a percentage increase, so that's probably worse. But it's still going to have roughly 50% uptime, which is good but not great. For your third potency conduit, this seems to be a much better choice than Soul Furnace, but it's not terrific. Alright, endurance conduits are a bit more straightforward. Viscous Ink is the best endurance conduit available to Vengeance Demon Hunters, but it's the best endurance conduit available to any tank. Just 9 to like 15% more magic damage reduction. It's insane, and it's always on. With this conduit, Vengeance Demon Hunters have more constant magic damage reduction than most other tanks do, with a defensive cooldown like Demoralizing Shout or Spell Reflection or Bark Skin active. It's incredible. Fell Defender is another great choice. It just cuts the cooldown on Fell Devastation, which is a major offensive and defensive cooldown. It's great. And with the option to pick up a third endurance conduit in the patch, Shattered Restoration is a decent option. It increases your constant trickle self-healing by a modest amount. It's good, but not nearly as big as the other two options. Patch 9.1 has also added Condensed Animosphere, which totally sucks. It gives a tiny reactive self-heal when you take damage on a 10-second cooldown. Now, despite the Wowhead tooltip here, which wouldn't be great, the in-game value at the time of testing was 0.35% of max health. That would make it worth like 20 to 30 healing a second, which is insanely terrible. If it winds up being massively tuned up to, be a much larger heal, then it could be okay, but the 10-second cooldown is very long. It would really have to be quite a large heal for that to be worth using, and I would not count on that happening. No, Blizzard makes this game still. It's not going to be good. Finally, let's cover Finesse Conduits. Fellfire Haste adds a little bit more mobility onto your main mobility skill. It's a really minor bonus, so I would go out of your way to just not take Finesse Conduits whenever you can as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, but if you have to, this would be the default pick. The other Finesse Conduits, not worth using. If you have to take two, you really should avoid taking two, but if you have to take two, just choose whatever you like. They're all bad. Okay, next up is Legendaries, and there are only two pieces worth discussing here, but I will need to say, first of all, that the domination socket system of this raid tier forces leather wearers to wear raid drop helms, shoulders, chests, gloves, and boots. So that means that if you have a legendary in any of those slots, you're going to recraft it, or need to recraft it into another slot. For Vengeance Demon Hunters, this really only applies to one of your chosen legendaries, which would be Fiery Soul. Previously it had gone on gloves, but now you're going to have to craft it onto bracers. It's one of the best defensive legendaries available to any tank, and it's the reason why Vengeance Demon Hunter is so unbelievably tanky in this expansion. Basically, this cuts Fiery Brand's cooldown down to 30 seconds, potentially lower. I mean, I've gotten like 26-second cooldown Fiery Brands before. This is absolutely the go-to legendary for Mythic Plus pushing and progression rating. I'll be honest, it's a little boring at times, but it's extremely, extremely, extremely tanky. I cannot say enough good things about Fiery Soul. The other good option is Collective Anguish, and that also goes on wrists. And basically, here's a little video that demonstrates what it does. Yeah, that's me, bursting out to 40,000 DPS for 4 seconds and then immediately dropping off. Probably going down to like a sustained DPS of 2,500 in AoE. This legendary adds a decent chunk of burst damage, and that is basically all that it does. It's very good for maximizing your AoE burst damage if you're playing a full offensive setup, but let me be clear, Vengeance Demon Hunter damage is bad. I'm 229 item level equipped, and I'm pretty good at the game, and I can barely break 3,500 DPS on Hungering Devourer. Meanwhile, I can snooze my way to 4,500 DPS there on a Druid who's like 3 item levels behind, and has a 7 item level weaker weapon, and worse trinkets. Vengeance Demon Hunter is good at huge bursts of AoE damage and absolutely nothing else offensively, and that's okay because it's tanky enough to be great at tanking literally everything in the entire game. There are some other options, but frankly none of them are as consistent or good as these two. I'll say Dark Glare Boon, that's what I'll say. I'll say Dark Glare Boon, it exists, look at it, it's RNG. I wouldn't recommend it. And just for the sake of completion, I will add that patch 9.1 added new Covenant-specific legendaries for each class. Do all the Demon Hunter ones suck for Vengeance? Yes, all the Demon Hunter ones suck for Vengeance. In fact, I could say that for all the tanks. There isn't one for tanks that I've looked at and gone, oh, that totally changes. Maybe Necrolord Prot Warrior. Every single other one, 23 other ones have all been, oh, I'll never use that. The Venthyr one for Demon Hunter seems like it might be the best of the four, but you should be Kyrian, and the Kyrian one is trash. In any case, you already have two good legendaries, Fiery Soul and Collective Anguish. Let's just move on. And now that we've covered the Shadowlands features, let's focus on the basics. Here's talents. This is the setup I would run for leveling, Mythic Plus, raiding, and every single thing other than parsing in raids. Vengeance Demon Hunter doesn't really have a lot of talent swaps. It has the normal defensive setup and a DPS focused setup that is still very tanky and pretty bad at dealing damage. The only talent swap in this build that I would point to is Sigil of Chains, which is very useful for Mythic Plus, but very often useless in raids. I would use Quicken Sigils for raiding since the cooldown reduction on Elysian Decree is a nice DPS increase, unless you absolutely need Sigil of Chains for a particular fight. Also, Burning Alive is useless in single target, so you should switch to Fallout in that case. It adds more healing and more souls to fuel your Fiery Brand cooldown game than Feast of Souls does. Feast of Souls is a trap. Don't fall for it. And now here's the damage-oriented talent setup. The swaps you make out here are switching Burning Alive for Fallout and Charred Flesh for Spirit Bomb. Spirit Bomb's a pretty big rotation changer, but frankly, it's not a huge damage gain. This isn't Legion. This isn't 2 expansions ago. Given how bad your damage output is outside of the huge burst you do every 50 seconds where you're getting massively overhealed by Fell Devastation, gaining 10% leech just isn't a good healing increase for a Vengeance Demon Hunter now. It's a fun change of pace and not horrendous in AoE, but it is generally very bad at dealing damage, and you really should only ever play this setup in farm raids. And even then, you're probably going to get embarrassed by your other tank. I mean, I do. I get embarrassed by Holy Pallies. It sucks, man. Whatever. Vengeance Demon Hunter has 2 rotations. I'll start with the normal one and go over the Spirit Bomb one second. The normal rotation is very simple and extremely forgiving, which is part of why Demon Hunter is so popular. Mainly, you want to use Fiery Brand and Elysian Decree as much as you can. And unless you're saving Fell Devastation to mitigate a specific burst damage event, such as, to use the last raid, Mythic Sire Denathrius Phase 3 Shattering Pain casts. You pretty much should just be using Fell Devastation as often as you can as well. Generally speaking, from a defensive standpoint, you don't want to overlap them. You want to, pull, have Demon Spikes up. As it's falling off, you'll Fiery Brand. Then as it's falling off, you'll Fell Devastation. Then as that's falling off, you'll get Demon Spikes back up. Then as that's falling off, you'll get Fiery Brand back up. Always have some sort of defensive layer up the whole time. Beyond that, the class is really just about using Immolation Aura on cooldown, generating souls with Fracture, and consuming them with Soul Cleave. I'll show the Spirit Bomb rotation now here, and it does play a little bit differently. The main difference is that you don't want to just simply Soul Cleave away your souls. You want to pool up your souls until you get to 4 or more, then eat them all with a Spirit Bomb. You can still use Soul Cleave. I mean, you should still use Soul Cleave in this rotation. You're going to want to use it when you're at 0 souls, and it's really just to eat up some of your fury, and it's really just to be a resource dump so that you're not sitting at capped fury waiting to spawn more souls. Otherwise, the rotation plays pretty similarly. You want to use Fracture, never let it sit on cooldown, never let Immolation Aura sit on cooldown, never let your big cooldowns sit on cooldown, blah, blah, blah. As for Demon Spikes, just to talk about it briefly, it's the simplest active mitigation skill in the game. You just want to use it as much as you can while tanking, and you want to try to make sure that you're not overlapping Demon Spikes and Fell Devastation's free meta proc. That's really the biggest defensive cooldown overlap that I would say you don't want to do. Otherwise, there's nothing else to manage. No resource, nothing, just a cooldown. It's really good. This class is so simple and forgiving. It's great. The basic stat priority for Vengeance Demon Hunter is pretty much the same as it always has been. Versatility is the best stat. It makes you tankier. It makes your healing better. It increases your pathetic damage. That's all great. You want as much as you can get. Haste is also the best stat. It really just depends on how much you have of haste or versatility as to which is superior. Generally speaking, it's going to be a lot easier to get a ton of haste on your gear. And so for that reason, I say versatility is better, but if you had exactly the same amount of the two somehow, I would probably go for haste. It makes the class more responsive. It feels better to play with having a bunch of haste. It increases your demonic spikes uptime by reducing the cooldown, which is fantastic. It shortens up your GCDs, which is why it feels good. It increases your resource generation, which increases your fiery brand uptime. That is all terrific. It's very good as well. Mastery is fine. I used to hate Demon Hunter Mastery. I still think it's lame. It makes your demon spike stronger, which is good, but that's basically the same thing that agility does, and it's not as good as agility is all around. So it's not a well thought out stat. It's pretty stupid, but it's not bad. And crit's good offensively, and it can reduce your damage taken a lot defensively, but it's not consistent. Sometimes you'll parry 2 attacks in a row that weren't going to be dangerous at all, and sometimes you'll get auto-attacked 4 times in a row by Sludge Fist and die, and none of them ever got parried. These things happen. Ultimately, the most important things to go after are item level and sockets, because item level is really the thing that increases your tankiness the most. More health, more armor, more main stat. That's really what it's all about. Sockets are just free real estate. They're just free stat budget. And then haste and versatility, kind of whichever you have the less of the two is the one that's better. And then the other stats, whatever. In terms of noticeable pieces of gear, most of it's pretty interchangeable. Lightless Force on both of your weapons is the way to go for dealing damage, but you could switch one of them to Sinful Revelation for pure single target fights. Not that it's going to add a lot. As far as trinkets go, there are some decent ones from dungeons and raids, and I want to highlight the best options. Phial of Putrefaction from Plaguefall is a single target DPS increase from Mythic Plus that's totally passive and very simple, but really good in single target. It's not good in AoE. It spreads around and wastes a lot of its stacking value, but in single target, it does a ton of damage. The best defensive trinket for Mythic Plus is Blood Spattered Scale, which is from The Other Side. It's an excellent defensive trinket. I would argue the best defensive trinket in the entire game. Probably will be this whole expansion, unless they do a better job with designing loot in one of the future raids. It offers a decent chunk of damage output, too. It's just really, really good. None of the trinkets from Tazavesh, the new mega dungeon, seem like super special, but Solea's secret technique is a pretty good secondary stat buff trinket. If you can find somebody who's stacking haste or versatility, or whatever, who will grant you haste or versatility, then it basically functions like another Stone Legion heraldry or potentially, a gigantic haste stat stick, which isn't something we have in this expansion. That's pretty cool. The best ones from Castle Nathria are Dreadfire Vessel from Sire Denathrius and Stone Legion Heraldry from Stone Legion Generals. Splintered Heart of Alar from Sun King is an okay cheat death trinket, but because Demon Hunter already has a cheat death mechanic baked into its kit, it's a bit of overkill. I would say for other tanks, that's maybe a more valuable trinket than it is for DH. Doesn't hurt to have, though. Most of the new trinkets from the Sanctum of Domination raid are nothing all too special, but there are a couple I want to point out as being interesting. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis from the 9 isn't a huge defensive boost, but it does seem like it could deal a good burst of damage in AoE fights and in Mythic Plus. In particular, the way that it seems to function, where it just eats like a portion of each hit, doesn't really make it seem like it's going to be very interesting or good at all in most of the raid fights in this upcoming tier. But if there's a situation where you're taking a bunch of tiny little hits over and over again, like, I don't know, maybe a final boss who has you bleeding and taking shadow damage dots and then is also hitting you with little hits a whole bunch of times, like maybe she's like a banshee or something, maybe that could be useful, but I doubt it. I think this will more wind up just being good for like pulling giant packs of trash in Mythic Plus and bursting them down, obviously. Decanter of Endless Howling from Soul Render Dormazane seems good on paper, but I found its proc chance in raid testing to be lower than I had expected, or than the tooltip, data mined tooltip info from Wowhead had indicated. So I would say it's good on paper, but you know, maybe needs some testing to be sure if it's as good as advertised. Buyer beware. Reactive Defensive Matrix from Guardian of the First Ones is interesting, but I think you'd need to be constantly tanking to get really good value out of it. And again, I found its proc rate to be pretty underwhelming. Since Sanctum of Domination's fights are basically all taunt swaps, I would say this is a bad raid trinket. In Mythic Plus, maybe it would be better just as a sort of constant defensive cushion. Not great, but, you know, not bad. Weave of Warped Fates is a weird cheat death trinket that gives you some control over when you decide to come back to life, but you know, you still are dead, so you're going to be missing all of your buffs. I don't really like it much, to be honest. In particular, I think in Mythic Plus, this would be a really bad trinket because you die, you come back to life, you don't have threat on anything, everybody's getting just obliterated. Yeah, I just don't like it. Tormed Rack Fragment and Relic of the Frozen Waste will probably wind up getting more use than any of the other options I've already mentioned, but frankly, they're just boring direct damage trinkets. There's really nothing all that interesting going on there. And lastly, there is one more special piece of gear I'd like to talk about. Cruciform Vein Ripper, a special fist weapon from Soul Render Dormazane. Cruciform Vein Ripper is potentially a decent DPS increase since there's a lot of taunt swapping and there's plenty of time in Sanctum of Domination that you could spend behind bosses while you're not actively tanking. But I don't think it's all that great looking either. I think, you know, defensively, obviously it's worse than just having a regular secondary stat weapon, but I think even offensively, with how much time you're not going to be able to benefit from it, I think a regular secondary stat weapon might wind up being a better choice. Patch 9.1 is coming and it should be a lot of fun. Vengeance Demon Hunter has been extremely popular and powerful throughout Season 1 in Castle Nathria, and there's no reason they won't hold that same position in the upcoming patch. It's a very strong tank. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Vengeance Demon Hunters and Shadowlands, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thank you for watching. Bye.